For millions of kids in the 1970s and 80s, Saturday mornings were sacred. Sugary cereal, pajamas, and all eyes locked on the TV as the world's greatest heroes saved the day. And right at the center of that ritual was Super Friends. But here's the strange thing about remembering this show. The Super Friends you remember might be completely different from the ones someone else remembers. Was it the version with those two kids and their dog, basically a Scooby-Doo knockoff? Or was it the one with the shape-shifting alien twins and their pet space monkey? Or maybe it was the epic version where the Justice League battled the Legion of Doom. You see, the crazy truth is, they were all Super Friends. Over a chaotic 12-year run from 1973 to 1985, this single cartoon franchise was rebooted, retooled, and retitled again and again. It constantly changed its format, tone, cast, and even its mission, all in a desperate effort to stay on air. Now, this isn't just the story of a beloved cartoon. It's the story of how network pressure, changing trends, and a relentless chase for ratings turned one superhero series into one of the most wildly inconsistent franchises in animation history. So when Hanna-Barbera launched Super Friends in 1973, it entered a television environment terrified of violence in kids' programming. Coming off the Vietnam era, even the name Justice League of America was reportedly considered too militaristic, so Super Friends was chosen instead because it sounded safer and more wholesome. Now that tone carried into the show itself. The first version featured Superman, Batman, Robin, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman, but they barely felt like superheroes. They didn't really battle supervillains. Instead, they dealt with misguided scientists, strange accidents, and confused aliens whose experiments had gone wrong. Physical conflict was heavily restricted. The heroes weren't supposed to punch, kick, or do much of anything that looks like real fighting. So nearly every problem was solved through calm explanations, teamwork, and lessons in good citizenship. It often felt less like a superhero cartoon and more like a public service announcement with capes. And to make things even more kid-friendly, the main team was joined by 3 audience surrogates: Wendy, Marvin, and their dog, Wonder Dog. And yes, the resemblance to the Scooby-Doo formula was very obvious. Now, it was a noble experiment, but as entertainment, it really struggled. The stakes just felt low, the action was minimal, and the stories moved at a crawl. And after 16 episodes, the series was gone by 1974, and it looked like Super Friends had failed. And then, superhero culture suddenly got much hotter. The live-action Wonder Woman series was a hit, and anticipation for the 1978 Superman movie was building fast. So, ABC decided maybe Super Friends deserved another shot. And in 1977, the show came back from the dead as the all-new Super Friends Hour, and this was the first major reboot. Now, the most obvious change was the disappearance of Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog. They were simply gone with no explanation. And in their place came 2 of the most infamous characters in cartoon history, Zan and Jaina, the Wonder Twins, along with their pet blue monkey, Gleek. Now, the concept was unforgettable. By touching hands and shouting Wonder Twin powers activate, Jaina could transform into any animal. Zan, meanwhile, could transform into any form of water: ice, steam, liquid, a bucket, a puddle even. If it was H2O, it was fair game. Now, the series was also restructured into an hour-long format with multiple segments, and that allowed the show to mix shorter adventures, educational bits, and dedicated Wonder Twin stories. It was clearly an attempt to solve the pacing problems of the 1973 series and make the whole thing just feel faster and more playful. Did it work? Well, sort of. The Wonder Twins became very iconic, but also very ridiculous. They were memorable, but they were also a punchline. But still, their addition showed that the network was willing to radically alter the formula if that's what it took to survive. So, after re-establishing the brand, Hanna-Barbera made its boldest move. In 1978, the show split into a 2-segment format. One half kept the lighter style, but the other half became the version fans still talk about today: Challenge of the Super Friends. Now, this was the game changer. For the first time, the series fully embraced actual superhero conflict. The roster expanded to include major DC heroes like The Flash, Green Lantern, and Hawkman, and facing them was an incredible lineup of villains united as the Legion of Doom. Led by Lex Luthor, of course, the Legion operated out of the legendary Hall of Doom, hidden in a swamp and looking like a pure comic book menace. The roster included Sinestro, Brainiac, Gorilla Grodd, Black Manta, Scarecrow, and more. And these weren't misguided scientists or harmless eccentrics, these were real villains with real plans to conquer the world. And suddenly, Super Friends had what it had always been missing: stakes. Challenge of the Super Friends delivered action, danger, and big comic book spectacle, and it finally felt like the Justice League animated series kids had probably wanted all along. For many fans, this was the franchise at its absolute best. It seemed like after years of trial and error, Super Friends had finally found its perfect form. And then, instead of building on that, the show changed again. So instead of locking in the success of Challenge, the franchise entered a long stretch of constant confusing reinvention. In 1979, the title became The World's Greatest Super Friends, and then from 1980 to 1983, it was shortened back to Super Friends. And during these years, the format shifted repeatedly, often mixing new material with reruns from earlier seasons. And that made the series feel repetitive and inconsistent. And also the roster itself became unstable. Hanna-Barbera introduced new heroes created specifically for the show, including Black Vulcan, Samurai, and El Dorado. And their inclusion was a meaningful attempt at more diverse representation, but it also made the lineup feel increasingly crowded and disconnected from the original core cast. And meanwhile, comic book characters like Firestorm started appearing, while classic members would vanish for long stretches. Aquaman might disappear, The Flash might be gone, and then someone new would just show up. The franchise no longer felt like one unified show, it felt like a patchwork. And this was the era where Super Friends became a kind of identity crisis in motion. The goofy Wonder Twins still existed, but so did more serious hero versus villain stories. One segment might feel silly and childish, while the next tried to be an action cartoon. Tonally, it was all over the place. And that's what makes this period so fascinating, actually. You can almost feel the network panicking in real time. Every season seemed built around fixing the last one. Add new heroes, change the title, adjust the format, repackage the brand, keep it moving, just keep it alive. And it worked in the sense that the show stayed on television, but the cost was that Super Friends never stopped reinventing itself long enough to fully know what it actually was. Now, the last chapter of the franchise brought two more title changes. In 1984, the series became Super Friends, the legendary Superpowers show, clearly tying itself to Kenner's Superpowers toy line. And then in 1985, for its final season, it changed again to the Superpowers team Galactic Guardians. Now, these final versions made one last push to recapture the excitement of the franchise's best years. The Legion of Doom was gone, but Darkseid was introduced as the major recurring villain, giving the show a bigger and more focused threat. Cyborg was also added, reflecting his rising popularity in DC Comics. Now, in some ways, these later episodes were more serious and more ambitious than much of what had come before. But by the mid-1980s, the cartoon landscape was changing fast. Shows like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe were bringing a louder, more aggressive kind of action to Saturday mornings. And compared to that, even the updated Super Friends could still just feel a little bit tame. After years of title changes, shifting formats, rerun-heavy seasons, and constant reinvention, the franchise finally ran out of steam. In 1985, after 12 years and at least 7 major retitles or retools, Super Friends quietly came to an end. The saga of Super Friends is one of the strangest stories in cartoon history. It began as a superhero show where Superman could barely throw a punch. It evolved into a bizarre experiment with alien twins and a monkey, and it hit its creative peak with Challenge of the Super Friends finally becoming the action-heavy comic book showdown fans actually wanted. And then it spent years reshaping itself over and over, chasing trends, responding to ratings, and trying to stay relevant in a changing TV landscape. Each reboot was a calculated attempt to fix the problem of the last version. But taken together, they created something both iconic and wildly incoherent. And that is what makes Super Friends so memorable. It wasn't just one show, it was several different shows wearing the same name. And that may be the real reason it lasted as long as it did. It survived not by finding the perfect formula, but by refusing to stop changing. So which version do you remember the most? Were you a Wonder Twins kid, or was the challenge of the Super Friends the one true peak for you? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this trip through one of animation's strangest franchises, be sure to like and subscribe for more retro TV deep dives. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.